Greetings, class, and welcome to week 10. Okay, I am shooting from my new studio, which is what we call the cat room. Behind me, you might be able to hear the cat snoring. This is where he sleeps. But this is the only quiet place in the house where I can record my lectures. I might start going back into school again, but I prefer to be safe, like you folks should stay safe too. So let's jump right into our lecture. So last week we talked about acting. This week we're going to be talking about, we'll be covering two things actually. We're going to be covering story, and we're also going to be covering writing because the two things go together. So first we want to start with story and structure and things like that, which will set us up for doing the writing part. So first we want to talk about narrative structures. And you can have a realistic or incidental structure, which has an emphasis on showing, might have an episodic structure, and the story tends to unfold naturally. The plot is there, but it's not going to be super obvious. And that's the kind of narrative you might have in what we would call a realistic film, the idea being that it's a very natural unfolding of the story. Next, we have classical. And this means you might have narration where necessary to clarify things. The structure is going to be more ordered. The chronology might be manipulated a little bit, but ultimately the story serves the plot so that everything ties up neatly at the end. The whole point is that, very much like classical cutting and just classicism in general, is you're creating something that's entertaining, that makes sense, and at the end of it, nobody really has any unanswered questions. That's the goal. And then you have a formalist narrative, which means you have showing and telling based on the author's viewpoint, which may or may not be a normal or even a coherent viewpoint. You can have a clear manipulation of events. The structure is going to be based more on theme than chronology in some cases. And the theme may be chronological distortion. The whole point is the movie moves backwards or something like that. The plot points might fit like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And it may defy conventional definition of resolution. I could think of at least one film we're going to be watching in this class that kind of does that. Next, we want to talk about the difference between story and plot. So the story is going to be the raw materials of the narrative. It's everything between the beginning and the end. Just all the stuff that's in there. Nothing to do with structure whatsoever. Okay, when you're talking about structure, that's when you're talking about the plot. So the plot is the structural pattern of the story, that which gives it structure and meaning. So plot points equal significant events. If you ever have anybody say, and I just heard my mom say this the other day, oh, that movie had no plot. That's actually not true. Every movie has a plot. It's just whether or not that plot works, whether or not that plot has a lot of energy, whether there's enough of those significant events, i.e. plot points, in order to actually hold your interest. So it's going to look something like this. Story is the top part of it, and then the plot is the bottom part. You see those points along there. Each one of those is a plot point, which is going to move that story along. So the plot is how that story gets told and how everything ends up hopefully leading towards something that ends up getting resolved at the end of this. If you had a movie that had a weak plot, then it might only have, one or two plot points throughout the entire thing. And if you had a film that had virtually no plot points, then you just have a plot that is just very, very weak, and you have very few plot points that are guiding you through it, and that's going to make for kind of a rough viewing experience. Next, we want to talk about the classical paradigm, which is a very specific type of structure. It's a very common structure as well. So your protagonist initiates an action, the antagonist resists. You have conflict, escalation, climax, and closure, and all of that's going to fit along that story versus plot timeline right there. So each one of those conflict elements is going to be a plot point as we go through there. And that's a very, very common way of shaping a film. Most of them are going to fit into the structure in some way, shape, or form. Next, we want to talk about showing versus telling. And you're going to have both of these in a lot of your films. Showing, an event occurs and we see it happen with our eyes. So a car crashes or a plane flies into a mountain, we actually see that happen. Telling, somebody tells us that an event occurred, so rather than seeing it, we just hear a person talking about that. That could be a character within the story or an external narrator. So an example could be a doctor recounts a harrowing operation to a concerned relative. You just hear him tell the story, but you don't actually see any snippets of what happened there. Also, telling plot-related information in a film in dialogue, or it could be narration as well, is what's called exposition, and that's a necessary evil in most movies. Any of you who've taken my writing class know that I'm not a fan of exposition. If you're going to do exposition, you should figure out a way to do it that's very natural. Too much exposition is just kind of like word vomit, and that's just way too much telling. So film, being a visual medium, should do more showing than telling. But there is going to be a balance that your film has. There's going to be some showing where necessary. There's going to be a little bit of telling when that is going to be the clearest way to do it. And also, if your film has a lower budget, it might be doing a lot more telling than showing because of that. It really depends. But as a filmmaker, you want to try to balance this. As a writer, as a story creator, you don't want to have too much telling, simply because showing is going to be a more dynamic way of telling the story. Now we're going to make the shift into writing. So first we have an original script. This means it's straight from the mind of the script writer, but it may be inspired or partly based on some other things that they've experienced. It could be a song or a news story or something like that. So examples of this are Taxi Driver by Paul Schrader, which apparently was inspired by a newspaper report and a song. Manhattan by Woody Allen, another one. Being John Malkovich by Charlie Kaufman. All these are examples of original scripts, meaning that this is how they originated. They didn't exist as a book or any other media prior to being written as a script and then later being turned into a movie. Then we have adaptations. Means it's based on a pre-existing work. It could be a novel, it could be a play, it could be a graphic novel, it could be a lot of different things. Now this can be a loose adaptation, meaning there's only a character or a situation which is being taken. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is allegedly an adaptation of the Odyssey. Sure, if you want to believe that, I'll believe that too. Very loose. You could also have a faithful adaptation, meaning every attempt is made to translate the literary work to the screen, with omissions and changes where necessary, because you have to remember that novels and movies are two very different things, and there are certain things you can put in one that you can't put in the other. So Lord of the Rings is a good example. That is a relatively faithful adaptation. There are a few things that had to be changed, a few things that had to be tweaked, but for the most part, you got the whole thing. They did a really good job of taking 3 books and turning it into 3 movies. And then you can also have a literal adaptation, which is very rare, but it does happen occasionally, which means all dialogue and all description is retained. And the only one I can really think of is Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet, which is 4.5 hours long. It's the entire play, everything there. Most of the time, it's going to be very difficult to do a literal adaptation, which is why you don't see very many of them. Now, the screenwriter, the person who writes the script, next to the director, is going to be considered the most important contributor to the film most of the time, from a creative standpoint. Occasionally can be seen as the author of the film. Sometimes people say, oh, I really want to go see this film because of the screenwriter in particular. Next, we have writer-directors, and this means that the person wrote it and they directed it. And if a person did that, then that means that, well, that is the person who was creatively responsible for the film. So many of the auteur directors, and we'll talk about the auteur theory a little bit later in this class, were and are writer-directors. So Ingmar Bergman is an example, Woody Allen as well, Francois Truffaut, we're going to be watching one of his films in a few weeks, Quentin Tarantino, Joss Whedon, Paul Thomas Anderson. All of those are directors and writers of their material. Sometimes they work with collaborators, but most of the time they are the person who writes it and the person who directs it. Now, very often you have multiple authorship. In fact, most scripts have multiple authors. So you might have someone who's a dialogue specialist who comes in and cleans stuff up. They get a credit. Plot specialists that try to fix things as well. You also have people who are cleanup artists, fixers of bad scripts. Sometimes you have egomaniacal stars that come in. It's like, I don't like the script. It doesn't work for me. Let's change it. Never really turns out that well for people. If the list is long, you should expect major issues with the film. It means that they ran into some problems and tried to fix it, and most of the time it's going to end up being, that whole too many cooks in the kitchen kind of situation. Next, we want to move on to figurative techniques, which are devices which suggest abstract ideas through comparison, agents of the subtext. If you folks have taken any literature courses, you've definitely covered some of these things, and they work similarly to how they work in literature, but since it's film, they're going to show up slightly differently, visually most of the time. So first we start with the motif. This is an invisible symbol which is incorporated into the realistic texture of the film. The whole key is it's going to be kind of subtle. So an example would be sewer gas and steam and Taxi Driver. In that movie you see several scenes where the taxi is driving past steaming sewers, and you also have this character in the film who is literally about to blow, kind of like that. So there's this comparison, and that repetition is what really gives you an idea of what's going on there. So they have to be repeated, and you notice it after you see it 2 or 3 times. So a subtle thing repeated, and you start to get that. Next we have a symbol, which is going to be a material object which contains dual meanings. This is definitely going to be a little more overt than a motif. So a tool could equal knowledge or something. An apple equals corruption, if we're going to get biblical here. A gun could equal death, etc. It's going to be more overt than a motif, as I said, and it only needs to be seen once. Very often in a film, if somebody has some kind of object, it is going to be symbolic in some way, shape, or form. Depending on the type of film, how overt that's going to be, whether it's a sledgehammer trying to hit you over the head, it's really going to depend. And next we have a metaphor, which is a direct comparison which cannot literally be true. So it can be seen in character or place names, visual comparisons as well. Most of the time in films, you're going to find it in what people call each other. So you'll have characters who have certain names, and it's a comparison to something. The film we watch today will definitely have some examples of metaphors with character and place names. Next we have a theme, which is what the motifs, metaphors, and symbols are all adding up to. So it's a pattern of meaning that's being created. Central message or idea, ultimately what the film is trying to say. And I'm sure you folks have had to write theme papers before when you were younger. What is this film really about? That's the theme. Continuing, we have allegory, which is one character or symbol represents a complex set of ideas. So one character's plight equals the plight of all humans or something like that. It can come off as too overt because trying to make that allegory fit is going to be something that's really hard to do within a truly realistic framework. I'm sure some of you have heard of Plato's allegory of the cave. That's a very complex and very rigid structure, narrative structure, which of course was used in the movie The Matrix. Next we have an allusion, which is a reference to an event, person, work of art, or literature. So an example would be the Trojan horse from the Iliad was referenced in the movie White Heat, which is a 1950s film noir film. Instead of a horse, it's a gas truck instead. A bunch of people sneak into it, break into the payroll office. Plato's allegory of the cave, as I just mentioned, gets alluded to in The Matrix, and also forms part of the structure of that film too. Next we have homage, which is more media specific. So it's an overt reference or allusion to another movie, director, scene, or shot. So it's an allusion, but it's film specific. The Untouchables, the 80s gangster movie, has a final shootout, which is a comparison and a shout out to Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin Odessa step sequence, which we looked at a little bit. There's a baby carriage going down the steps, definitely a reference to that. Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, which we just used to call Star Wars, definitely pays a lot of homage to Hidden Fortress, which is a Akira Kurosawa film. If you watch those two films, they're very similar. And also The Magnificent Seven as well, which is and The Searchers as well. There's a few specific shots and scenes which seem like they're lifted straight out of The Searchers. So a lot of movies will do that. If there's a reference to another movie within the movie you're watching, that's important. Okay. So the movie for this week is The City of Lost Children from 1995. And written and directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Caro, who also did Delicatessen. I believe they also did Alien Resurrection together, which was like the last film where they worked as co-directors. With additional writing by Gilles Adrien and Guy Laurent. I'm not French. I can't pronounce French very well. I just try to muddle my way through it. So our synopsis for this film: a mad scientist suffering from nightmare-induced insomnia kidnaps the town's children to steal their dreams. Searching for his lost brother, the circus strongman stumbles onto a strange cabal of scientists, pickpockets, and religious cults. Yeah, it's weird. So it's an overtly stylized film, which makes heavy use of object symbolism, visual motifs, and metaphors. When you're dealing with something that's not particularly realistic, you can throw all kinds of stuff in that and get away with it. And this film definitely kind of pushes that as far as it can. So our questions this week: number one, what is the story about? Going back to the topic of story. So what is the story about? Who is the protagonist of this film? What is his quest? And who is the antagonist? And I could also say who are the antagonists, because there could be multiple ones. There could also be multiple protagonists too, so we'll try to list all those things. Number two, describe the use of symbolic color. So pay attention to the use of color in this film. It is very important to the meaning of the film, and kind of goes back to how we talked about color meaning earlier in the class, but now we're kind of adding symbolism to that as well. Number three, what is the purpose of the repeated Christmas sequence? So you will see this Christmas dream sequence repeated several times through the film. If it's repeated, that's obviously going to be important. So we want to talk about why that is important. And then I want you to look for what motifs, symbols, metaphors, and allusions you notice in this film. So look for all these things and pay attention to it. There's a lot of, it's almost like a scavenger hunt looking for all that kind of stuff in this film. So enjoy. I will point out this film is French, so there are going to be subtitles. But I'm trying to include captions for all of these films at some point anyway. So enjoy, and I will see you folks week 11.